My name's Alistair Burt, and I'm a former Minister for the Middle East. As such, and as a backbench MP for over 3 decades, I've taken a long interest in the Middle East peace process in various iterations, and lived through a number of moments of significance, some recognised as such at the time and others only later. We're approaching one such moment already recognised as such, the potential for Israel to proceed with elements of the so-called Trump plan, most notably from July the 1st, the annexation of land currently designated by international law as occupied, although Israel disputes both terms. To discuss this, I've recorded for the Conservative Middle East Council, in the last couple of weeks, a series of podcasts of around 40 minutes each, and I express my very warm thanks and appreciation to Hussam Zumlot, the head of the Palestinian mission to the UK, to Mark Regev, the outgoing ambassador of the State of Israel, Nickolay Mladenov, the UN Special Coordinator for the peace process, and Ian Black, journalist and author most notably of Enemies and Neighbours, Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel, 1917 to 2017. I hope you agree this could not be a more informed group at such a time. All are long-standing friends, and my approach has been to let Hussam Zumlot and Mark Regev largely make their own case, Nickolay Mladenov to explain how he is approaching this particular moment, and then discuss all three with Ian Black. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you find the talks worth your time, which is much appreciated. I'm now about to speak to Nickolay Mladenov, the former Foreign Minister of Bulgaria, who is now the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. The UN has been intimately involved in this, and Nickolay has been in position for some years and knows the situation very well. And I'm very pleased he's been able to join us. Nickolay, you and I have known each other for some years when you were Foreign Minister and I was just the junior minister in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. How did you get from there to your role now?
Thanks, Alistair, and it's great to be with you again virtually from Jerusalem. After our government resigned and we lost the election in 2013, then UN Secretary General asked me to join the United Nations as the Special Representative for Iraq, which I did because I knew the country quite well from before. First time I went to Baghdad was in 2005 and to help the authorities set up the new parliament. Then, while I was in Iraq, Daesh came into Mosul and took over about a third of the country. So we were very intimately involved in making sure that the Iraqis were able to form a national unity government that later became the core, the political core of fighting the Daesh and restoring sovereignty over the rest of the country. And after that, in 2005, I moved to Jerusalem as the special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, which is a very pretentious title given the fact that there is no Middle East peace process currently. And since then, we've been involved very much in everything from keeping the peace in Gaza, preventing another escalation in the south, to desperately trying to restore some dialogue between the Palestinians and the Israelis in the interest of peace and stability for the whole region.
It's really good to speak to you as well, and thank you for the bit of background. You know the region incredibly well, and so being there from 2015, you described a Middle East peace process as not existing. What were your expectations when you got the special coordinator's role?
I think back then the situation was very different from what it is today as well, and I think my expectation back then was really that we would work in close coordination with our American, European, Russian regional partners to try and create the conditions that would allow the Israelis and the Palestinians in the future to return back to the negotiating table. I think it was quite clear, even in 2015, that the situation was that both sides were drifting apart very significantly. And that our role, at least this is my belief as the international community, really is to try and bridge the gaps and bring them back to a meaningful negotiation. And why do I say meaningful? The first time I used that word, somebody in New York in the UN said, "Oh my gosh, you're introducing new language." And I said, well, it does make sense to talk about meaningful negotiations because we shouldn't be in the process of just asking them to sit at the table for the sake of sitting at the table and satisfying the international community. There must be a good reason for both sides to be able to bridge their gaps and move forward. In 2016, we worked quite intensely on producing what came to be known as the Quartet Report, which looked at conditions on the ground and the dangers of to the two-state solution, the risks that what we have currently, we had back then as well, would lead to a one-state reality in which one people, the Palestinian people, would be perpetually occupied by Israel, and there would be serious risks for escalation in the future and for continuation of this conflict. We came up with a set of recommendations which we thought are important to both sides in order to create conditions for a meaningful discussion on how to restore the hope that the two-state solution is still alive. But since then, that report has pretty much remained just that, a report. Very little of it has been acted on by both sides, both by the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I'm afraid that since then the situation has deteriorated even further.
You would have come in, I think, right at the end of John Kerry's efforts to reach a settlement, and President Obama and John Kerry in particular had devoted a significant part of his life and career into this. So that must have been a very disappointing moment. But then a new president who, although it's not unique that a first-term president takes it on, there's been examples of that, but quite often it's always been a second-term presidency issue, or more often than not. And a first-term president decided to take it up and put in place a structure of representatives for him who were not the John Kerry type career diplomat and who had been involved in this process for so long. What was your sense when you heard about the process? What was your expectation from that process when it was set out?
Well, going a little bit back to John Kerry's time, I think John's perseverance must be really admired in trying to come up, extraordinary, to come up with terms of reference that would allow both sides to work together. I'm afraid that his effort was very much at the end of the Obama presidency, and that, I think, pushed both the Israelis and the Palestinians, as well as the region, to hold back on any meaningful engagement, awaiting a new president to arrive in the White House.
And it ended with if I recall right, it ended with quite a sharp speech from John Kerry about it. And
it was a very sharp speech, and it ended with a resolution. Yeah, a sharp speech and a resolution, which I think reflected very much the disappointment and the frustration that Kerry and his team felt throughout this period. But, as somebody recently said to me, peace in the Middle East is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So we don't have to be prepared for a very long engagement. President Trump, when he came in, pretty much decided to change the entire way that this question had been approached for a very long period of time. His team was different. It was not made up of the usual State Department functionaries. It was much more political. The file was really centered in the White House rather than dealt by the foreign policy establishment in Washington. And their preferred approach was to work alone on a proposal for a peace plan that they deemed would be acceptable to both sides as a basis for discussion. And to do that without really any consultation with the rest of the international community. They did extensively speak to both sides, to the Israelis and to the Palestinians on the ground. Extensive consultations took place. We all chipped in and provided advice, but until the plan was ready to be announced, it was really not seen by any side. And certainly they took some decisions which pushed the Palestinian side further away, namely the decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and to recognize Jerusalem as capital of the State of Israel. Now, why did that anger the Palestinians? Certainly because the status of Jerusalem had long I think now more than a quarter of a century, being defined as one of the final status issues that both sides need to bilaterally agree on. And the US move was seen by the Palestinians as a way to take that issue off the table. Similarly, with funding for the refugee agency that deals with Palestinian refugees, etc. So that was a very, very different approach to try and come up with a new proposal that the expectation that the Americans had would become the basis of a discussion, effectively changing the very terms of reference for these debates for about a quarter of a century. Looking at it from today's perspective, that proposal has been made by the US, but it has not become the basis of negotiations, and it has not become the basis of engagement. In fact, we've deteriorated even further to the point at which the Palestinians and the Americans are no longer talking to each other, and Israel is discussing with the United States possible moves to unilaterally annex parts of the West Bank. So the situation has really become far more complex since even a year ago. And where it goes from now on is pretty much anyone's guess, depending on what decisions are taken in Jerusalem as far as Israel's plans to possibly annex, U.S. plans to possibly recognize such annexation, the reaction of the Arab countries, the reaction of the European countries, and certainly the reaction of both the Palestinian leadership and Palestinian people. And I separate these two because I think we have to take into account that the leadership will have one set of issues when they make their decisions how to react, yet people might have very different calculations, more emotionally driven.
I'd like to come to the consequences of the announcement in a moment, but can I stick with the process for a second? When the team was announced, Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, and with the inevitable involvement of Ambassador Friedman in Jerusalem, the American ambassador, it appeared very difficult from the outset to describe the team as in any way neutral on the issues they were dealing with because of their connections with the settlement issue. And as time went on, as you say, the decision by the United States to move its embassy and the like, it would seem to suggest a negotiating position that was almost impossible for everyone, impossible for Palestinians to deal with this as a neutral body, and impossible no matter what the agreement or what the deal was when it was finally announced, not to have been seen as partial because of the very nature of the setup of the team from the White House who were dealing with this. Do you think that's a fair challenge as to the President of the United States' determination right at the beginning to do something new, that the negotiation process was flawed right from the beginning?
Well, some have said that, particularly on the Palestinian side, some have said exactly that accusation. I would, however, sympathize with President Trump's position that you needed a new approach to how to deal with this problem here. And that certainly what has been done in the past has not really produced the results that everyone had wanted. There have been endless rounds of negotiation, and very little has improved in the lives of Palestinians. In fact, settlement construction and the taking of land had continued. Very little had improved in the security situation for Israelis. Hamas still controls Gaza. Rockets are fired at Israeli civilians all the time. So one can sympathize with the idea that there needs to be a radically different approach, perhaps, to this. I would have preferred that radically different approach would have involved more substantial engagement with those who have the power to bring the two sides to the table, namely Europe, the Russians, and the United Nations, the Quartet. And certainly where it would have become really important is opening up these discussions to the Arabs, because I think very different today than from maybe a couple of decades ago on discussions of Middle East peace. The role of Arab countries, particularly of those countries who seek to work together with Israel against common security threats and normalize their relations is much, much more important than in the past. So I would have thought that more consultation with the Arabs, with the Europeans, with the Russians, with the UN on how to come up with a proposal that really is that can become the basis of discussion. I'm also very wary of the fact that anyone from the outside, be that America or anyone else, can really sit down and draw a map of other people's countries. We've seen enough troubles historically from that approach, and certainly in this part of the world as well. So I would have preferred very much that whatever proposal was put on the table really left both sides to discuss issues related to the final status of the borders, the security arrangements, the economic arrangements, and everything else that needs to be worked out. Now, that would have been a different approach. Unfortunately, what we have now is a situation in which we have really no basis on which to bring the parties back together. We have the US proposal, which the Palestinians have rejected, and they refuse to sit down on the basis of that proposal. We have the so-called internationally agreed parameters, a number of UN resolutions that the rest of the world pretty much believes should be the basis of a negotiation. The Israelis and the Palestinians are not able to sit down on the basis of those resolutions. And thirdly, we have a set of bilateral agreements between Israel and the Palestinian leadership that have developed since the Oslo Accords that are now very much under threat. Effectively, most of them are not, if not all of them, most of them are not being implemented. Most recently, President Abbas, in his reaction to the threat of annexation, announced that the Palestinians no longer feel bound by these agreements. And this creates a lot of uncertainty for the future. That is why I'm not just careful what I say and how I phrase it, because I don't think anyone really knows where it all goes from this point forward. Whether Israel goes ahead with annexation and the reaction of the Palestinian street, the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian factions, Hamas and various others, the region, or if Israel doesn't go ahead with annexation, I really feel that it's going to be extremely difficult to return back to what we've had before these discussions started. So there might be a real need to reinvent the entire relationship between the State of Israel and the Palestinians, with or without annexation in the future.
I think you characterize it extremely well, in that we've reached an extraordinary crunch point in which either doing something or not doing something leaves an unsatisfactory ending. And I just wanted to unpick it for a second. The general reaction to the announcement in January has been negative, apart from Israel and the United States. The Arab League, and there were representatives of the Arab League at the announcement, but it has hardened up its position since then. And it seems to have become very focused on the annexation issue, because that is the first part, in a way, of the plan. Israel has passed its own legislation to say under Israeli law it will be legal for the Israeli government to act upon the plan from July the 1st. So that date is fixed in people's minds. Although the visit of Secretary of State Pompeo recently to Israel was generally interpreted by people as being a little bit of a caution and a pause rather than wholehearted support. And we have a situation in which, maybe by accident more than design, we have reached exactly what you were describing, a point where people have got to decide to do something. If annexation is stopped, then what next? If annexation goes ahead, what next? And quite correctly, as you said, by taking a different approach and maybe forcing all of us into a situation where the status quo, as it cannot really continue because of the lives of people involved, Palestinian lives, the lives in Gaza, the lives of those who feel under threat in Israel because of attacks and the like. None of this is satisfactory. And maybe in some way the Trump plan and July the 1st has given us a particular point at which some of these difficult questions have to be confronted. Behind the scenes, is there a lot going on to say this is a Rubicon moment? If Israel acts, then so many bets are off. If Israel doesn't act, what is the Palestinian and the Arab reaction going to be? Do you think there is an opportunity, and is there more of an opportunity for those in Europe and others to say, we cannot let this drift on, it's too dangerous? In what way could we use the opportunity that's coming towards us, like an express train, actually to make some progress?
Well, yes, there is a lot of going on behind the scenes. And I really believe that if there's one thing that certainly the Trump proposal has achieved, that is that it has shaken up everyone. And it has shaken up all sides, Palestinians and Israelis, international community, Arabs and everyone, into realizing that we can't go on the way that we have until now, which has very much been to manage the conflict within some reasonable, quote unquote, parameters, limit the fallout of any violence, and continue subsidizing the Palestinian Authority pretty much in the West Bank, without really the horizon of a real resolution to the conflict. Now, having been shaken out of that situation, I think there's one great misperception. And that misperception is that the Trump plan is about annexation. The Trump plan is not about annexation. And the possibility of annexing some territory in the West Bank by Israel is one of the aspects of the plan, but it includes a lot of other proposals. So anyone who says, well, we're annexing because the Trump plan said so is very much wrong. And the American proposal, I think, has some constructive ideas in it and needs to be looked at very, very carefully. Certainly, if it's been rejected by one of the sides, it cannot be the basis for a negotiation. But we need to find that basis in any case. Now, the question becomes of what happens next. And I fear that if Israel were to move ahead with unilateral acts of annexing territory in the West Bank, and currently there are different options that are being discussed among the Israeli leadership and the media, 30%, which includes the Jordan Valley, or a more limited annexation of just some of the big settlements closer to the 67 lines. If any of that were to happen, I think it would really destroy the prospect of moving forward in negotiations for a very long period of time. The Palestinian leadership has already decided to stop coordinating its security and civilian affairs with Israel, which has a lot of very severe practical consequences on the ground for people. We've heard some very strong statements from Arab countries, not just through the Arab League, but individually. Jordan, His Majesty the King of Jordan has been very vocal about the risks of annexation. Most recently, we saw the United Arab Emirates, all the way to their ambassador in Washington, publishing an op-ed in Hebrew in the local press here, saying, look, you can't have normalization and annexation at the same time, in more words, of course, than that. And just a couple of days ago, Mohammed bin Zayed, His Highness the Crown Prince of the UAE, also coming out with a statement that they're opposed to the quote-unquote illegal move of annexation. Now, this is really needs to be taken into account as decisions are taken. And I really hope that debates within Israel will continue on this, and I do hope that they will not proceed with annexation. Israeli public opinion is as well divided on this issue. It's not a universally accepted question, and certainly among Jewish communities internationally in America, I suppose in Britain and elsewhere as well, this is a divisive issue. What we're looking at now is if annexation happens, what would then be the role of the United Nations, for example, in trying to preserve some level of contacts between the Israelis and the Palestinians if the relationship completely collapses? And we're looking at some contingency plans for that, which are quite important because of a lot of humanitarian and other concerns. But we also need to look at the other option, and that is that the current situation of indecisiveness drags on, and that there is no immediate decision to annex or not to annex, which would make this unclarity that we have today continue for a longer period of time, and that would be very much more difficult, in fact, to address. Or if Israel decides not to proceed with annexation. Now, if that were the case, I do hope that that opportunity that may be created in that environment would really allow both the Israelis and the Palestinians to reimagine, rethink the entirety of their relationship. And Alistair, I'm sure you recall, we've had many discussions on this. For example, on the nature of the economic relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, which was designed in a different era. It was designed in the 90s. And life has moved substantially on since then and needs to be modernized to the benefit of all. So there are lots and lots of questions right now that we can't really answer, and we have to prepare for different scenarios. But my primary task, sitting here in Jerusalem, in Ramallah and in Gaza, is really to see what can be done to restore dialogue. Because without dialogue, without all sides talking to each other, we're heading for a disaster. And we need to get the Israelis and the Palestinians talking to each other. We need to get the Americans and the Palestinians to talk to each other. We need to keep the quartet of international mediators in place, and we need to stay engaged with the Arabs and the region. So it's really a precarious time, and it can go in very, very different directions.
Again, you set it out extremely well, from all the different obstacles that there are and the problems that are in the way, and it would seem to require some further event in order to promote that discussion that ultimately needs to take place between Israel and the Palestinians in relation to this. To what extent does the rift between Ramallah and Gaza continue to make life difficult for the Palestinians to be claiming they are representing all the Palestinian people, and to allow Israel to say they haven't really got a partner for peace? Would it make a difference if there was a serious reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, a process of elections? Would that be seen as a catalyst for, on the Palestinian side, if Israel was not to proceed with annexation and was to stretch out an opportunity to try and make the most of the rest of what was in the Trump plan?
It would be a massive game changer. Really massive game changer if that were if that were to happen, and the reason why is because the fact that the Palestinian Authority has not been in control of Gaza for more than a decade now has led to really two completely different legal systems emerging: one in Ramallah and the West Bank, and one in Gaza. Two completely different realities for people. Palestinians in Gaza have had to live through three wars, almost four. They've lived under the control of Hamas for that entire period. But very importantly as well, it has really blocked the democratic Palestinian political process because it has not allowed for elections to take place. So all the Palestinian institutions in Ramallah, their legitimacy can be questioned because of the lack of elections. The political parties cannot function meaningfully without elections. And this rift really has been like a cancer from a Palestinian perspective. And myself and my team have spent endless hours of trying to bridge that gap, sometimes with little bits of successes, most of the time with great disappointments, because of the real unwillingness of both sides in this Palestinian debate to make the compromises that are necessary to give up weapons, give up the militant buildup that is in Gaza, and join hands politically. Were they able to do that? Were they able to restore a single unified representative government between Gaza and the West Bank? This would allow, and this would allow really for much of the relief that Gaza needs to come in more freely, opening up of the crossings. The political process would be revived. Elections can take place. A new generation of leaders can emerge, perhaps, and this is very, very necessary. Unfortunately, more than a decade of bitter political struggles between Fatah and Hamas, the COVID-19 crisis, the threat of annexation, none of this has been able to push them into making the concessions that they need to come together. Last year, we worked very intensely on creating conditions for elections to take place, for example, and most of the agreements were put in place for those elections to take place, and ultimately the decision was never taken. Very, very, very disappointing, in fact.
All of us who have been involved one way or another over the years, ministerially, parliamentarily, those who have observed from outside, we've all seen moments of significant crisis. Somehow things continue, but as you said earlier, things get managed, but nothing actually gets better. On that scale, is it possible for you to estimate just how serious this particular point is? At risk is the normalization process, which has been going on for some period of time. The risk of the prospect of Israel being fully plugged into a Middle East economy with benefits for everyone being lost. The issue of statehood and justice of a resolution for the Palestinians being put off yet again, with perhaps a new generation of Palestinians saying none of the peaceful activities to seek change have been successful. The American position being seen to have moved from an honest broker to something quite different. And as you said, a very split opinion in Israel between a very strong right-wing settler movement and others who are deeply unsettled, and a stronger reaction from Jewish communities around the world of worry. Is it possible for you to say this crisis is potentially more serious than any of the others we've seen, in which case it would make your appeal to parties in the UN, to Arab states, to Europe, to say you can't just let this happen. It is too serious. We could face another serious conflict. Now is the time to pile in on those who must make a decision between themselves in the negotiations and say, you cannot let this crisis happen, and you cannot let the status quo rumble on, because it is ultimately unstable and it will lead to disaster. Is this the point to make that sort of plea, or in 5 years' time we'll just be talking about the same things again?
I believe it is, actually, and I really believe that this is a fundamentally different political crisis than the crises we've seen in the past. The reason, perhaps, why many are not seeing it as such in the international media or elsewhere is because over the last years we've said so many times, "Oh my gosh, this is a serious crisis," and then somehow, because of piling in, we've all been able to handle it and manage it, and avoid the real collapse toward which this situation is heading. And that is why people perhaps don't see it this time as clearly as we who are here and deal with it on a daily basis. But I really believe it is a very serious crisis, and I think it's going to be extremely difficult for the Palestinian leadership, for example, to go back to the way things were, even if annexation were not to happen, restoring security coordination, restoring civilian coordination, receiving the clearance revenues as if nothing had changed. And I think it would be very difficult for Israel to go back to the way things were managed before, as well, even in the absence of an act of annexation. The international community also needs to realize very, very quickly that we've become all too comfortable with managing the conflict for more than for a very long time. I mean, even more than a quarter of a century.
Sure.
We're used to managing it, and we can't continue to do so for various reasons. Donors, and we see this on a daily basis, donors are increasingly under pressure because of their domestic situations. The global economy is shrinking. There's a COVID-19 emergency everyone needs to focus on. So we're seeing donors less willing to fund as before. We're seeing other priorities. I mean, look at the region. Look at Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq. Wherever you look, there's massive humanitarian and other emergencies that need to be dealt with. So there's less and less attention, and certainly from an Arab perspective, there's a certain level of tiredness with dealing with this file, with no prospect of a meaningful and just resolution. Now, all of this spells trouble, and it spells massive trouble at every single level that we can look at. And to me, perhaps the first sign of that trouble will be when people stop believing that the conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, can be resolved in a just manner for both sides through negotiations. Once people stop believing that negotiations are a reasonable way forward, then we are likely to see a radicalization in the street, be that religious or otherwise. We're likely to see those who have more destructive agendas in the region poke their fingers into this conflict more actively, causing trouble, and ultimately that will lead to a spiral of violence, which nobody wants to see. And certainly from an Israeli perspective as well, the situation it will not look positive. I would say that from Israel's perspective, the most really enchanting, if you wish, exciting opportunity for the future is the prospect of normalizing with the rest of the Arab world, of really integrating into the region politically, economically, opening up embassies and the flow of people and the flow of trade and the economy. That would be a massive boost to peace. And if that prospect becomes less likely and is more difficult and more challenged because of the situation on the ground, because of the risk of annexation, because of other factors, then that would have been really an opportunity lost, historic opportunity lost. Because I think, given where the whole region is today, there's such a need for that cooperation to come out openly and to be embraced by everyone, that it would be really a loss to everyone if we're not able to do that. So from my perspective, it's really, it is really a critical time, and it's a critical time also for Europe as well, and how Europe individually and collectively approaches this conflict. It's no longer enough, I think, to just say, well, here are our parameters, and take them or leave them. You need a much more active engagement by Europe with both sides, not just with one side, but with both sides.
And as a final question, are you optimistic that what is clearly a warning from you about the consequences of assuming this can be managed, are you optimistic that your warning will be heeded even now to prevent what you've described as a possibility?
Well, that's a tall order to be an optimist in the Middle East in the middle of this. But
anyone who actually goes to the Middle East and takes on your role is an optimist by nature, and all of us as democratic politicians have struggled with.
We must be
all of this.
optimistic. We must be optimistic, and we must do everything that we can. And yes, there is, I think, a growing realization around the world and here and in the region of the dangers ahead of us and of the need to act decisively. So I'm optimistic that we're making a strong case to public opinion, to politicians, to everyone that of the consequences of different decisions. I'm not really optimistic that we can manage the fallout if they take other decisions. I mean, certainly at the humanitarian level, probably we will be able to, but I don't see the United Nations or anyone really replacing the functioning of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, or becoming the buffer between Palestinians and Israelis, except perhaps for humanitarian and other health-related issues. But we have to persevere. We have to persevere until the very end. And I'm now, as we speak, involved in a last-ditch effort to try and get the quartet, with no preconditions, to re-engage with both the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Arabs to try and find a way out of this situation. And we've got some, encouraging signs of willingness to do that. Again, nothing has been decided yet.
Nickolay Mladenov, UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process. Thank you for your extraordinary perseverance in relation to this and your commitment to it. And thank you very much for spending time with CMEC this morning. Really appreciate it. Thank you.